各位同事嗱，我哋呢個
Right, members. This is the Telecommunications Apparatus Exemption from Licensing Amendment Order 2012. Now the subcommittee will now start the meeting. We've already got a quorum, so can we first elect a chairman? I would like to nominate Mr. Peter Charles Mock. All right. All right. Do we have a seconder? Mr. Wong Ting Kwong. Yes, I second the nomination. Any other nominations? No? Then Mr. Mock is elected chairman.
好，唔該，早晨。係啦，我哋不如盡快請官員。
Right, please invite the administration in.
PowerPoint 先。
係啊，我知道，係。主要都係問問題同埋開唔開公聽會嘅啫，係啦，唔該。好，我哋請今日嚟幫我哋解釋嘅官員就座，咁就。
We have from the administration, Mr. T.F. So, Assistant Director Operations of the OFCA, PAS for Commerce and Economic Development, Mr. Ivanhoe Chang, Senior Telecommunications Engineer Spectrum Planning from the OFCA, and Ms. Carmen Kwok, Senior Government Counsel, Department of Justice. I understand that they're going to give us a PowerPoint presentation first.
都係咩少少睇到嗬？
我哋都有個黑。
係咯，我哋睇到有佢先咯。
簡報咧，其實。
Chairman, this PowerPoint presentation is based on the electrical brief on the subject issued earlier on. Please speak into the mic. Yes, Chairman. So this presentation is based on the electrical brief on the subject issued earlier on by the Bureau. At the meeting of the EXCO on the 11th of December last year, the Council advised and the CE ordered that the Telecommunications Apparatus Exemption from Licensing Amendment Order 2012 be made under Section 39 of the Telecommunications Ordinance to amend the Telecommunications Apparatus Exemption from Licensing Order by withdrawing the licensing exemptions granted to persons in respect of personal handy phone system apparatus.
PHS 呢個制式咧，其實
PHS was launched in the early 1990s. It originated from Japan, and it's a radio communications technology. And in 1997, PHS was introduced into Hong Kong, mainly for home cordless telephone. At the moment, under the exemption order, now, if the prescribed technical criteria are met, then there is exemption from the licensing obligations under the Telecommunications Ordinance. But then PHS must operate within the 1895 to 1906.1 megahertz band. And I want to say that, in fact, the Hong Kong system is a bit different from the Japanese system. In Hong Kong, PHS is used for private use only. It's not used for the provision of public service. And also, PHS is not allowed to give rise to harmful interference to other telecommunication equipment or systems. Now, we have discovered that PHS has not been very successful or popular in Hong Kong. In fact, there is a voluntary certification scheme, and we haven't received any application for certification since 2002. But then, during the same period, for the OFTA as well as the OFCA, we've dealt with over 500 certifications of DECT phones. Now, DECT phones are another type of home cordless phones. And then we did a survey in September 2010 on PHS, and no PHS apparatus was found to be on sale in the local market. In fact, there are very few users of PHS, and so if we keep the status quo, then that would not amount to the most efficient use of our radio spectrum. Now, in fact, since 2010, we have been monitoring the utilization of PHS spectrum, and we've discovered only use in 5 districts, and in fact the use of PHS has been on the decline over the past 2 years. So, and in fact, PHS, the PHS spectrum has in fact been put under IMT. IMT is for the provision of 3G and 4G. So we can see that for this spectrum, the first part is assigned for DECT. The last part is for 3G, and the PHS is in the middle. And you can see that there is some duplication with regard to the PHS and somewhat in the middle there's duplication, and so we will only be able to vacate the 1900 to 1904.9 megahertz band. And we will also need to amend the present exemption arrangements, and that is why we have this amendment order. And in fact, we have a transitional arrangement to minimize any possible disruption to existing users. Existing users will enjoy a grace period of 3 years. But then when the order commences, then dealers can no longer sell such apparatus, and when Hong Kong residents travel abroad, when they come back, they can't bring with them back to Hong Kong PHS apparatus. We are of the view that maintaining the status quo is not desirable. We need to make the best use of radio spectrum, which is a scarce public resource, and we have to make the most efficient use of our limited radio spectrum. And we understand that there is increasing public demand for mobile communications service. Mobile communications operators need more spectrum for the provision of mobile services, and so we really need to have this radio spectrum for mobile communication services. So let me say something about the amendment order. Sections 4 and 5 provide for the transitional arrangements. Section 7 provides for the withdrawal of licensing exemptions granted in respect of PHS apparatus operating within the 1895 to 1906.1 MHz band by removing this band and the respective technical criteria from Schedule 2 of the existing exemption order. And let me now come to public consultation. In March 2011, the former TA consulted the Radio Spectrum Advisory Committee. Members were generally in support of the withdrawal of the licensing exemptions granted in respect of PHS apparatus. And in November 2011, the former TA launched a 10-week public consultation, and one submission was received, and it was in support of the proposal. We understand that there is the Radio Spectrum Advisory Committee. The committee comprised many members, including the Consumer Council. We understand that we need to inform the public of the transitional arrangements. If LegCo passes the order, then we will remind the industry and members of the public of the amendments. And once the order or the amendment order commences, the industry can no longer sell PHS phones to the public. And of course, the 3-year transitional period will immediately start. During the grace period, and when the second stage comes into effect, we will publicize the amendment order. And then in the third stage, in other words, during the last 2 months of the grace period, we'll remind members of the public that they should stop using or possessing PHS phones. But for DECT phones, there are over 700 models which have been certified, so there are a lot of choices available. And then 2.4 or 2.5 gigahertz home cordless phones, again, there are a lot of choices for users. So we will provide publicity materials, including posters, press releases, free advertisements, or advertisements on free newspapers, and there will also be radio APIs. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Teng. Mr. Sin Chung Kai, I've got a few questions. Have you contacted the retailers or the dealers? Did they import such apparatus in the past 3 years? Do you possess such import records? Not because when the amendment order comes into effect, retailers can no longer sell such products. They either have to return the products to the manufacturers, or they will have to absorb the loss. And then 3 years later, I mean after the expiry of the grace period, what if an individual still possesses a PHS phone not for sale? Is it a criminal offense to possess the phone after the 3 years? And then say after the amendment order comes into effect, what if someone brings a PHS phone back to Hong Kong from Shenzhen? Will that amount to a criminal offense? Yes, thank you. First of all, on retailers, when we considered the measure, we tried to find out whether retailers were selling such phones, and the answer was in the negative. We understand that PHS phones are not popular, so you can't see these on the shelves. What about their import records?
For the retailers, if they are normal operators or a sales operator, we should have their records. According to our records, no more PHS apparatus had been imported because in the past decade there's no more PHS market in Hong Kong. If a person still possesses the PHS apparatus after the enactment of the legislation, basically he should be held criminally liable. If a citizen continues to possess or use such apparatus without any knowledge, normally we won't take out prosecution. Normally the apparatus will be confiscated. Thirdly, about import. If the apparatus is imported from Shenzhen, I don't think anybody will have such an intention. I mean, he's buying such a phone for himself unknowingly. Well, because at the boundary control point in Shenzhen, there are a lot of strange and funny apparatus. Well, PHS may not be sold. I understand that in the past, an apparatus known as 小靈通 in Chinese was sold. But the method of use for 小靈通 is different because it's a public service. But now we're talking about private use. For private use, the necessary apparatus is different. You need a base unit before you can operate and use your PHS. If you buy a 小靈通 from Shenzhen, you must have an operator before that operator can be used. Otherwise, it's useless. We've checked the mainland, and there's no more supplier for such apparatus. So it's very, very unlikely that people will bring in such apparatus from Shenzhen. Well, if somebody is caught at the boundary control point that is bringing in such an apparatus, should he be held criminally liable? Yes. Well, it's not for trade purpose. It's just for personal use. Well, Mr. Chairman, it's very simple. If a Hong Kong citizen brings such an apparatus into Hong Kong and possesses such an apparatus or operates such an apparatus, he is criminally liable. Similarly, as I explained just now, if a citizen unknowingly does this, normally we won't take out prosecution, but just confiscate the apparatus. So what's the criminal liability? Is against Section 8 of the Telecommunications Ordinance. That is, without a license, he possesses or operates such an apparatus. What about the punishment? Well, I'll check and answer you later. Mr. Sin Chung Kai, any more questions? Mr. Ronnie Tong? Mr. Chairman, first of all, after the scrutiny exercise on companies' ordinance, I no longer believe in the consultation exercises conducted by the administration. Just now we're told that there was a consultation, a 10-week public consultation. Can we have all the details first before we conduct a public hearing? We do not know whom they consulted, how many were consulted, any member from the public. He said that there's one supporter. Is the administration silent on the number of opponents? Well, after the company's ordinance, I don't trust the government anymore. So please ask them to come back with the consultation details. And secondly, I don't understand what PHS is. When an ordinary person buys a telephone, he does not know what telephones are not allowed under the law and what telephones are allowed. So there must be clear stipulation on what an offense is, or what is an offense, or what is not. Well, just now the answer was not very precise. If you possess a telecommunications apparatus with no exemption, he has breached the law because he does not have a license, but he can apply for a license. I would like to ask, can he apply for a license? And if he applies for a license, Chairman, I don't know how much he has to pay. Well, if he holds a telephone and cross the boundary control point, you don't know whether he is to apply or not. There can be a receipt. So how are you going to enforce the law? Mr. Chairman, after the public consultation exercise, we published a statement of Telecommunications Authority. It's on the 1st of March 2012. In that paper, we summarize the consultation results. As for the consultation document and the statement of the Telecommunications Authority, we can furnish members with all the documents. Please do so. The second issue is whether or not the person can apply for a license. No, the second question is how can an ordinary person differentiate between lawful apparatus and unlawful apparatus. There's one simple method. That is whether you find a label issued by the Communications Authority. Well, should the label be attached to the phone? Generally, the apparatus supplier can stick such a label onto the phone. Members may note that their telephones at home also bear such a label. Well, I have not read such a label, so there will be a sticker. Well, usually at the bottom of the phone. Oh, at the bottom of the phone. Did you conduct publicity? Because that is to tell the public that a lawful apparatus should have a label. Yes, we do have leaflets to educate members of the public that when they buy apparatus for their personal use, they should inspect whether or not there is a label issued by the Communications Authority, the CA. Well, if this piece of legislation is enacted, you will have a fresh round of publicity, right? To advise members of the public to check whether their phones are lawful. Yes, as Mr. Ting mentioned in his PowerPoint presentation, there will be 3 phases of publicity. So at different stages, we'll have different strategies. Well, the strategy is that you have to tell the public that they cannot use PHS anymore. Secondly, you have to ask them to check whether there's a label, because in the past decade or so, there's no more PHS, save for parallel goods. Well, what about licensing? Well, if after the 3-year grace period you apply for a PHS, basically we won't issue a license. Well, if somebody unknowingly, well, he does not know whether it's a PHS phone, he brings that in unknowingly, can he apply for a license? Well, if that's really a PHS apparatus, we'll not issue a license. If he cannot differentiate whether or not the phone is PHS, he can ask us. On our website, we have uploaded all the lawful apparatus. Well, I mean, at the time when he crosses the boundary control point, he does not know whether it's a lawful apparatus. Well, because he may think that he can apply for a license. Are you saying that at the boundary crossing points you may not be able to check? Well, in law, can I bring in a telecommunications apparatus hoping that I can apply for a license? Are there such licenses for them to apply for? Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned whether or not they have the power to confiscate the apparatus. Yes, they said that they had that power. Well, until the person's application is refused or rejected, you should not confiscate the apparatus. Mr. Stroh, will there be a license? Just now I already said that after the 3-year grace period, we won't issue any license for any PHS apparatus. So no application can be lodged because the frequency band is no longer in use, the apparatus will not be allowed. The whole objective is to recover the frequency band for other users. So we won't issue any more licenses to such PHS apparatus. So it's not a matter of licensing. PHS is only one type of cordless phones used in Hong Kong. There are other types of cordless phones. As we introduced in the past, DECT, DECT phones, were most popular. In Hong Kong, most cordless phones are DECT phones, which can totally satisfy public needs. And there are other cordless phones using other frequency bands. We don't think any person will unknowingly bring such a PHS phone into Hong Kong because there's no merit at all. What if it does happen? Well, that chance is slim. Nobody will do that. Nobody will commit an offense. They're always saying this, but what if that happens? The LegCo has to handle different scenarios. Well, let Mr. So go back and check. I asked Mr. So about punishment. Mr. Chairman, this is not within this piece of subsidiary legislation. Is this general penalty? Section 8 of the Telecommunications Ordinance stipulates that if any person without a license possesses or uses radio apparatus or telecommunications apparatus, he commits an offense. Mr. Chairman, that section is not subject to scrutiny under this order. Well, that gentleman was shaking his head. If that is not the case, please let us have a look at the relevant provisions in other pieces of legislation. Mr. Chairman, concerning penalty is under the Principal Ordinance, Section 20 of the Telecommunications Ordinance, which stipulates that if Section 8 is breached, as mentioned by the Department, then if there's a conviction under the Summary Offences Ordinance, a fine, a level 5 fine that is $50,000 and 2 years imprisonment may be handed down. If it is prosecution, a conviction will attract a penalty of 5 years of imprisonment or a level 6 fine, that is $100,000. Well, quite terrifying. Let me reiterate that if a person unknowingly imports, uses, or possesses such apparatus, normally we won't take out a prosecution. Well, you say normally, that is generally. You won't take out a prosecution. But that's not written in the law. So that's quite terrifying. As I said, this is not the forum for this discussion. I think when we come to clause-by-clause scrutiny, we have to follow up on this. Any supplement? Simple supplement. Throughout the world, there are different types of apparatus. Some of them may not suit Hong Kong. If they're brought into Hong Kong, it's unlawful and are regulated by the same legislation. So PHS is nothing special. Mr. James Toh? Mr. Chairman. Next one. I raised my hand very early. You're the next one. Sorry. Mr. James Toh. Mr. Chairman, my question is like this. Can you assess a certain scenario? Well, at present there's an exemption, so no license is needed. Can you estimate how many households have such apparatus? 8,000, 10,000, or what? As I explained, in the past 2 years, we did monitor the use of signals, And from November to the beginning of this year, we inspected the densely populated areas in Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the New Territories in 5 districts. We monitored the signals. Of course, we could not inspect all areas. Only a few hundred households were using the operators. Signal monitoring is not very accurate in assessing the number of users because indoor cordless phones can only be monitored when they're issuing signals. In fact, in the past 10 years, nobody came forward for certification. And for PHS, it has an instinctive restriction. It originated from Japan. In Hong Kong, DECT phones, oh, you don't need to explain anymore.
Now, I'm not talking about further imports. I'm just asking whether you can allow such phones to die out gradually and naturally. Now, I haven't checked, but I no longer use such phones at home. In fact, I no longer have a fixed line phone. I only have a mobile phone. But then that cordless phone is still there, though it's not in use. I mean the home cordless phone. And I don't know whether it's PHS or not. Now, what if there are several thousands of families using PHS phones? Now, of course, you publicize the fact that people should not buy such phones, but then these phones may still operate normally. So can there be a grandfathering arrangement? Yes, I understand that you're going to provide for a 3-year grace period. But can you allow these phones to be phased out or allow them to die out naturally? And they won't be able to buy such phones in the market. Now, for example, if someone is using this phone and then he sees the publicity material and he doesn't know what sort of phone is at home. Now, he is. I believe this person may be someone who is who doesn't keep abreast of such developments. And then 3 years later, there will be an offence. And then if it is said that there is harmful interference to other telecommunication equipment, then it will be a very serious offence. Now, because you're talking about a width of 4 point something only, is this band really that useful? And you know, a few years later, people can no longer buy such phones, and then you know, the battery can no longer be charged. For certain phones, you can no longer charge the batteries, and you will not want to buy the battery because the battery is more expensive than buying a new phone. So can you allow natural wastage, and can you allow these phones to be phased out gradually and naturally? How long is it going to take? Yes, Chairman, Mr. James Toh is right. Now, if such telecommunication apparatus can be used for 10 years, that would be really remarkable. But then I want to say that we haven't received applications for certification since 2002, and so we are reasonably confident that very few people are using PHS phones. Now, you know, I think there is some few apparatus which can operate normally for 10 years. And then the 4.9 megahertz band, whether that can be and will be put to good use. Now, in fact, we already explained in the PowerPoint presentation that this band falls within the IMT band. In other words, the spectrum for 3G and 4G phones. And so this spectrum can be vacated for use for 3G or 4G purpose. But then this band is not a widely used spectrum. But then the fact that this is not commonly used today doesn't mean that it won't be commonly used in 3 years' time. As we all know, mobile communications technology has been developing extremely rapidly, and so it is quite likely that the spectrum can be used for mobile communications service. So you are only believing that the spectrum can be used in 3 years' time. So can you have this commencement order, say after 3 years? But then we have to allow for a grace period. And so we don't want to waste 3 years. But then at the moment, I want to say that you've detected signals. Now, you keep on saying that there are very few people using such phones, but there's no way you can estimate how many people are using such phones. Now, I haven't set a time limit for each member, and the other members may want to ask questions. So we can't have one member going on and on. I want the information for the next meeting, Chairman. That is, I want them to estimate how many people are using such phones. Are these phones still operating normally? And when will they cease operating normally? I understand that if people use the phone, then there will be signals. And we understand that these home cordless phones are connected to fixed line phones, and they are at a ready-to-use mode or even an emergency mode. Say, for example, at home, I use a mobile phone as the emergency phone. Only 3 persons, including my domestic helper, knows the number. And my mother seldom uses the fixed line phone, but then when the fixed line phone is used, it's for emergency purpose. So it's really on a standby situation, right? Can you try to come up with such an estimate? Now, you mentioned 5 districts, so can you tell us, say over a 2-hour or a 3-hour period, how many people used the phones? Because I started using such phones when I was in secondary 3. And I will also try to do a survey via the internet, or I will reach out to my constituents to see how many still possess these phones. So are you in fact telling people that they should throw away their PHS phones now, or are you going to, or do you want to promote green recycling, say by Green Power or Friends of the Earth? So if you force people to throw away thousands of such phones, that would not be environmentally acceptable. But maybe only a few people are using such phones. We don't know. So I want you to come up with an estimate, right? Please come up with an estimate. And of course, we know that the vacated spectrum will definitely have economic effectiveness. Mr. Wong Ting Kwong, I don't think anyone will still import such phones into Hong Kong. Businessmen know how to do business. They have many other types of apparatus to trade in, and they will not want to deal with products without a market. But I want to know whether it's sufficient for you to ban import and sale and not use and possession. In other words, as Mr. James Toh has said, can you allow these phones to be phased out naturally? You know, such phones will cease to operate normally after a few years. Now, there are some families and members of the public using such phones at home, and I don't know, and I don't think they know how to differentiate between DECT and PHS. In fact, members of the public don't know what is 3G. They don't know what radio spectrum it is. I understand that you have tried to emphasize to us that there are very few users at the moment, and you're saying that you will not take prosecution action lightly. Still, I think you are creating a time bomb. If you take prosecution action, nobody can challenge you or query you because the offense is written in the law. So can you ban import and sale and not possession and use? And I'm sure a few years later, such phones will have been phased out. This is my first question. Second, some members of the public may want to find out whether there are home cordless phones, PHS phones. They do not have the professional expertise to judge. So is there somewhere they can or someone that they can turn to so that they know whether their home cordless phones are PHS phones? If the answer is yes, then will you charge a fee for the check? Because some may be worried that the cost to comply with the legislation may be too high. Now, I'll answer the easiest question first. Now, if members of the public do not know whether their phones are PHS phones, then they can look at the label, or they can visit our website to see whether the model is an approved model. And if they can't see what is written in the label, they don't know whether the phone is a PHS phone, then they are welcome to bring their phones to the OFCA. We are most willing to carry out simple tests for them. Is that fee charging? No, it's just a simple test. And then what about the first question? Banning import and sale and not use and possession. Yes, Chairman. If we allow people to use or possess such phones, then that spectrum may not be totally clean, so to speak, and as a result, the value of that band will be diminished. If I want to use that spectrum for 3G or 4G use, and if everybody knows that there may be interference, then that band will have diminished value. But then if we can ban possession as well, then we can, under the law, confiscate the apparatus so that the interference will no longer exist. And so there is a need for us to ban possession and use as well. Chairman, I want to follow up on my first question. So the administration is not going to consider banning only sale and import. So in other words, members of the public who do not have the professional expertise, who do not know how to check on your website, that these people will have difficulties. Now, these people do not know how to deal with or read the labels. They do not know the address of the OFCA. They simply do not know whether they do possess a PHS phone. But then if you discover that he really possesses a PHS phone, will you accept ignorance as a defense?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, after the amendment is enacted, we'll do publicity will do publicity after the enactment, will educate the public how to differentiate their phones from others so that they can comply with the law. Just now, members were worried that if a person unknowingly continues to possess or operate such an apparatus, will not take out any prosecution, will only confiscate the apparatus such that the apparatus will not interfere with other lawful apparatus. So that will be our approach. Well, Mr. Chairman, publicity and education as well are different from being educated and receiving publicity. If I don't have the general knowledge, I cannot accept your publicity and education. So I'd like to put on record my views. Just now, the administration told us when the legislation is implemented, the apparatus will only be confiscated without prosecution. I hope that this can be put on record. That is to indicate that the LegCo has already expressed its concern. Well, the administration wants to remove this frequency band. After the 3-year grace period, there won't be any more licenses, there won't be any more exemption. But at most, the administration will only confiscate the apparatus and will not take out prosecution. Just now, the legal advisor already explained the punishment provisions, which are rather terrifying, because there are fine as well as imprisonment. So is criminal liability. Whether or not the court will hand down heavy punishment is another matter. It's very troublesome to go to court because you are talking about inspection and confiscating apparatus only. That's not so troublesome. So we should put it on record that in the legislative process, there's such a legislative intent. Just in case in future the administration takes out prosecution, we can produce today's discussion as a defense. Mr. Chairman, I just want to supplement one point. Well, I said that when a person unknowingly continues to possess or use the apparatus, will not take out prosecution. So I have to emphasize unknowingly. But if it is malicious interference, that is, we've notified the person the message and the person maliciously interferes with the frequency spectrum, will take out prosecution. Yes, I understand that the administration is talking about unknowing breach. Of course, malicious interference should not have our sympathy. Well, but usually that will not be written into the law. Legal advisor? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the information from the department, Section 8, I believe, is Section 8(1)(b. It's about possession and use. And of course, malicious interference, or whether or not the person does it knowingly, is not mentioned. I believe the administration will have normal discretion. That is, only under certain circumstances that the provisions will be invoked. Well, Mr. Wu Chi-wai is going up. I'll give the floor to Wu Chi-wai first. I've noted you speak in the second round. Mr. Chairman, it's rather simple. First of all, I did purchase such apparatus. The label is at the back, but it will not differentiate between 1.8, 1.9, 2.4 DECT or what not. There's a label with no such words. So if a person buys an apparatus, that suits the licensing guidelines of the CA, he does not know whether or not in future that apparatus is lawful or not. So the label can only tell you whether or not the apparatus can be lawfully owned or possessed. Well, once be lawfully possessed or owned. Now that's very clear. And then in the PowerPoint, something is clear. The frequency band is very narrow, and the apparatus is simple. There's a base unit. For 1.8, 1.9 phones, they may not be able to send signals piercing through brick walls. So, if it is a comprehensive 3G frequency band, how can the base unit be used for public broadcasting? I mean, how will such phones affect public broadcasting? So if you have a strong signal, then you can interfere my home phone because you're talking about a strong band. But how can a small phone interfere with public broadcasting? So let's go back to Mr. James Toe's remarks. Only you will be affected, not public frequency bands. So let these phones be phased out naturally. Well, Mr. Chairman, these home cordless phones can interfere with 3G and 4G services. We have quite a number of cases in which when members of the public operate such cordless phones, they were able to interfere with 3G and 4G services. The power is sufficient to do so. Mr. Ting can elaborate. Because these phones can emit signals that can reach the base units of 3G and 4G services. Perhaps Mr. Ting can elaborate. Perhaps I should supplement on what Mr. So said. We discovered a lot of cases with DEC 6.0, a mode operated in North America which could interfere with 3G and 4G services. And we do have genuine cases. Yes, the power of these phones are rather weak, but there's a base station at home. Although the power is weak, but if you hold your cordless phone and go near to the base unit, even though the power is weak, the signals you can receive from 3G and 4G services are rather strong, so they can be interfered with. What if I'm downstairs? Well, if you have a home cordless phone, you walk near to the base unit, although the emission power of the base unit is weak, but you are very near to the base unit, so the signals are relatively strong. But if you're on the ground floor, the signals are from a faraway base unit. So among signals, they have to compete in terms of strength. Well, what Mr. Wu Chiwai said was that only the person himself was not affected. He won't affect others. Well, if I'm on the ground floor of my home and use the phone, will I affect others? Well, chance is slimmer then. The existing exemption exempts apparatus that can be used in general circumstances. But in future, if the frequency bands are used by 3G and 4G services, it's not very desirable for 3G and 4G users to be frequently affected. Well, if the frequency band is to be used for 3G and 4G services, then members of the public should better use other types of phones. Well, let me continue. I don't think I'm wrong. It seems that these PHS phones are rather limited in use because the signals cannot pierce through walls. If you walk farther away, you may be affected. About half a year ago, I bought another 1.8 phone. At that time, I did not know that 1.8 phone was about to be phased out as PHS phone. It was under sale. The price was cheap and is regulated by the CA, so I bought it. So I have to declare that I've bought such a phone. Well, I'd like to have another method to release the frequency bands for 3G. But if interference or mutual interference is rather weak, then as Mr. To said, it's better to let the phones phase out naturally. In fact, no importer imports the phones anymore. Maybe half a year ago, they already cleared their stock, knowing that this law is coming. So you should release the frequency bands sooner for 3G services. Mr. Chairman, concerning 1.8, I think Mr. Wu bought a decked phone, which is lawful, because 1.8 is decked. I know the phone is lawful. He is telling you that your phone is not PHS but decked. But he used the 1.8 frequency. Mr. Ting, maybe you should refer us to the PowerPoint slide, which tells us what is lawful and what's not. You can see decked and PHS overlap in their bands. Decked is 1880 to 1900, 1880 to 1900. So you can only buy decked now, no more PHS, which was phased out 10 years ago. That means if you buy a product, you'll be told that it is a personal headset system. Well, to put it briefly, if you buy an apparatus with a label from the CA, then you can visit our website, which will tell you which type it is, what model it is, and what frequency it uses. I think you should go back and check. I think it's a deck phone. And deck phone is not affected in this exercise. No, not affected in this exercise. Mr. James To, asking for a second time. Mr. Chairman, after listening to all these, can we have a solution? I'm not sure if Mr. Wu has really bought a PHS or something new. At present, we have an exemption. Well, I don't know throughout the whole world where these phones are prohibited, because we don't know, and we may buy a phone in a jurisdiction that considers the phone lawful. Now, for imported apparatus, you don't need to consider the existing exemption and the exemption in the 3-year grace period. Now, let me give an example. Can you lengthen the exemption period, the grace period for home use phones? Thirdly, as Mr. Wong Ting Kwong said, if it's not malicious or intentional possession or use, I think under the law, you're talking about absolute intent at the moment. That is, no intention is required for conviction. Now, you have this communications policy, say in 6 years' time. Well, of course, you go everywhere to check, to detect the illegal apparatus. Well, if you detect one, you will confiscate it or whatnot. Can the administration go back and think about this? I'm thinking about livelihood. I don't want to force people to prematurely give up their phones. Mr. Chairman, number 1 and number 3 should have no problem in relation to intention. It's not just PHS phones. In general, when we want to take out prosecution, if we discover that the person commits the offense unknowingly in the unlawful use of such phones, we don't take out prosecution. So we have to look at the whole case. If the person commits the offense unknowingly, it's not necessary for us to take out prosecution. Our main purpose is to remove interference. And we're not just talking about PHS, so no problem. But if you want to extend the possession period, then it's rather random. You can say 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years. The issue is if members of the public can continue to possess such phones, the frequencies cannot be used for other purposes. If we have no legal basis to confiscate such apparatus, then basically the frequency band cannot be used.
你都話啦，第一。
Mr. Wuchi has already asked this question, and that is that in fact the user of this phone himself will be affected, and you've already and you have banned imports for a long time. And very few individuals will bring in such phones. Around the world, you can't find absolutely clean radio spectrum. So I think you can allow these PHS phones to die out naturally, to be phased out naturally, and then meanwhile that band or that spectrum can be developed for mobile communications purpose. You can't find any absolutely clean spectrum. But then there may be interference caused to a 3G or 4G station. Mr. Lam. Concerning the first point made by Mr. James Toh, I want to say that after the order commences, then import and sale will be banned immediately. And then possession and use will be unlawful after 3 years. So in fact, your concern has already been addressed in this amendment order. But you want a period more than 3 years, right? Yes, I understand that you need to strike a balance between two issues of public interest. But then you can have one side rising, the other side dropping. So, all right, so people can build up the network after 3 years. I think you may need to consult telecommunications operators who may be interested in bidding for the spectrum. But I can't consult everybody in Hong Kong as to how many of them still possess such phones. What if, say, there are 50,000 people in Hong Kong still possessing and using such phones, and then there are people who spend half a year in Hong Kong and then half a year in the mainland, and these phones are still at their homes, but they're not used. You know, in fact, the spare parts do operate well, but of course the battery may not be very long-lasting. And as the demand is so small, I don't think anyone will import batteries because not normal 2A or 3A batteries are used for such phones. Because I don't want people to criticize us for approving a measure which requires them to throw away phones which still operate well. But then we understand that some telecommunications operators feel that a 3-year grace period is too long. So I believe we'll need a second meeting. I believe we may also need a public hearing. Right, Ronnie Tong? I'm still a bit worried about criminalizing the possession of such phones after the grace period. I don't have too much expertise in criminal prosecution, but I understand that the courts deal with possession in different cases differently. For example, possession of drugs, possession of broadcasting equipment, possession of phones. But I think the proposal is unreasonable. Mr. Seal, sitting here today, said that prosecution action would not be taken lightly. But then Mr. So may be promoted, he may retire, and say, so I'm still worried. You can't just tell us that normally speaking, prosecution action will not be taken. What if there is a Falun Gong member, you can't catch him because he is a Falun Gong member, that then he happens to have such a phone? So then you may take prosecution action against him. And there may be people who may inadvertently break the law. You may say if the case goes to court, the court will, under normal circumstances, acquit the person. But then people do not want to go to court. They are worried that their bosses may fire them if they have to go to court. So, as Mr. James Stowe has said, let these phones die out naturally. Do not punish these people. Now, there are people who have been using these phones. They do not know that these phones have suddenly become illegal. Now, if someone brings in the phone, you may be able to establish the intent. But then, say, for example, for the home cordless phone at my home, I don't know whether it works or not. I don't know whether it's a PHS phone or not. In fact, I bought it a long time ago. In fact, Chairman, the home cordless phone is simply connected to the fixed line. So it's not a matter of telephone tariffs. I pay tariffs for the fixed line, not for the use of this cordless phone. I know electrical members have a difficult job. 2 years later, maybe people will criticize us for not having consulted them, and we will be the target of criticism. I don't think this is really unique to PHS. In fact, there is other telecommunication apparatus which is not PHS, and if people use or possess such apparatus unknowingly, we do not take prosecution action. So this policy doesn't merely apply to PHS phones. Now, I wish to follow up on members' questions. The Bureau keeps emphasizing that normally prosecution action will not be taken, but then members are worried that you may really take prosecution action. So can you give us some figures about confiscation of telecommunications apparatus? For example, DEC 6.0 brought into Hong Kong from the U.S. So were there cases that you confiscated the apparatus because the members of the public possessed or used such apparatus unknowingly? And in how many cases did you take prosecution action, and why? And I think members need more information to decide whether they want to take your word as to prosecution action will not be taken in most cases. And in the past, did we have telecommunications apparatus having to be phased out either in Hong Kong or in other countries in order to vacate certain spectrum? And if the answer is yes, then we can make reference to those cases. And can you also consider allowing these phones to be phased out naturally? And in fact, say one may have brought in a phone many years ago. It has never been used, and I in fact have one phone brought back to Hong Kong, and I haven't used it at all. It's still new. It's still in the box, and I really do not know whether it can still operate normally, say after 3 years. Now, as to whether we phased out telecommunications apparatus because of the need to vacate a spectrum, I want to say that this is the first time. This is because we do not want to cause too much nuisance to members of the public. But then for PHS, we are really reasonably confident that it's worthwhile phasing out the phones in order to vacate the spectrum. And in the past 10 years, we did not receive any application for certification of PHS phones, and we have looked around. We can't see PHS phones sold in the market, and we are reasonably confident that there are very few people using such phones, and that is why we are proposing to vacate the spectrum for other purposes. I want to say that, in fact, we have all along been adopting a very cautious approach. We've chosen PHS because we think the conditions are right for us to implement the measure. I want to know whether PHS phones are commonly used in other places in the world. In Japan, but then such phones are used for public service. So people can't use apparatus they bring in from Japan because they can't use it. But then what if people buy the apparatus and do not use it? Now, but then I also bought a phone from another country. I didn't use it. In fact, I cannot use it. It's just all right. And then what if some retailers still have some PHS phones in their stock? Will they try to sell such phones before the amendment order comes into effect? So how can you protect the interests of the consumers? So, Chairman, at the sales level, sale will be immediately banned upon the commencement of the amendment order. But then, of course, possession and use will be banned after the grace period. So, Chairman, sale will be banned immediately upon the commencement of the amendment order. But I don't think any retailer will import a lot of these phones during this period because there is no market at all for such phones. The last question. So members are concerned that there may be people who still have such phones at home, and they're concerned about the criminal offense created here. But another equally important issue is the spectrum. I understand that telecommunications operators want more IMT spectrum for their use. So can the administration tell us when the spectrum can be sold by auction the earliest, and how many operators will be able to make use of the spectrum? Because I think we need such information to weigh these public interest issues. Now, may I refer members to the slide? From 1904.9 to 1919.9, in other words, the blue spectrum is at the moment for 3G use. So the spectrum has been assigned to 3G operators. But then the spectrum is not being used at the moment. So, why is it the operators have bidded for such spectrum and are not using the spectrum? And this is because there is a TDD at the moment.
當然啦，喺內地其實已經係。
That's not very popular, although it's already used on the mainland. Anyway, it's not very popular. In Hong Kong, it's not yet in use. In future, if we can take the 4.9 megahertz frequency, then we can have a radio spectrum of 20 megahertz. We'll consult the public on that. I don't think that will have immediate use. Otherwise, the 3G service is already using the 3 bands. But that does not mean that the radio spectrum is not useful. The radio spectrum will be developed part after part. For TDD spectrum, on the mainland, they are promoting very greatly the TDLE band. So it's absolutely possible for 3G to evolve into 4G in future. So we believe a 3-year grace period is appropriate. Members, any more questions? If not, we have to decide whether or not it is necessary to further consult the public and invite them to air their views on the proposed amendment. And just now we already raised some concerns and we need some more information from the administration. Mr. Ronnie Tong, I'm concerned about consultation. Well, the administration told us that nobody opposed the company's ordinance. Now, almost the whole city is opposing that. So how can I trust the government anymore? So we have to conduct a public hearing and do what we should. Even though 100% of those who are coming say that they support the government, at least in future, if something happens, we can tell people that we don't just trust the government. Well, with such a piece of subsidiary legislation, it seems not very appropriate to call a public hearing, but there's no alternative because the credibility of the administration is very low. So I think we have to make a decision on this. We'll let them come back with all the consultation documents and we'll study them to see whether or not there are any problems. And Mr. Chairman, do we need another meeting? I rely on your able leadership. Mr. James Toh? Well, I've no special request for a public hearing, but I also ask for more information. I would like to know how many people still possess these phones at home and will be affected, and I'm concerned whether or not 3 years is enough as a grace period. So we need information about your consultation exercise. Perhaps we should do this. Honestly speaking, if we call a public hearing, since they've conducted a public consultation before, we understand that this is not the only consultation exercise that had received so few views. I don't think there would be just a few kaifongs come. I believe we'll end up with a group of telecommunications operators come to ask us to, as soon as possible, recover the spectrum. So I don't think a public hearing will be really very useful to us. I hope that the administration will go back and respond to our concerns raised today as soon as possible. And then we'll decide whether or not we need another meeting. We'll examine whether or not we find the administration's response acceptable. Do we need another meeting? Well, we'll have to go through clause-by-clause scrutiny anyway. We won't stop here. So we'll wait for the papers to come before making a decision. Extension? What about extension? At the next House Committee meeting, we'll ask for an extension, 23rd of January. And then the scrutiny period will last till the 6th of February 2013. And because of the extension, the scrutiny period will end at 27th of February. Well, can we ask the administration to come back with the documents as soon as possible? Yes, as soon as possible. We all want to do it quickly. Don't say as soon as possible. Ask them for a timetable. We can have our next meeting on the 22nd of January, if not 28th of January. I hope that the CA can give us the information as soon as possible. Oh, that means next week. Can you do that? We're talking about next week. Next week, 22nd. Before that meeting, you have to give us the information that we asked for just now. So can we fix our next meeting for the 22nd of January from 10:45 to 12:45, still in this room? What day is that? Tuesday. Well, between you and me, there's a clash of meetings. I think we'll work that out later. If there's no further question, I believe we can adjourn our meeting today. Thank you very much, officials, for coming here to answer our questions.